Actually, learning to land or take off consists in learning to handle the airplane as though it were two separate and distinct vehicles, as different from each other as, well, say a motorcycle and a speedboat. On the ground, the plane has handling characteristics which are entirely different from those it exhibits in the air. Then there is the transitional period when the plane is partly a ground vehicle and partly airborne. When you start your takeoff, you're taxiing. When you finish it, you're flying. When you begin a landing, you're flying. When you finish it, you're taxiing. So, in between these 2 points, you are in effect taxiing and flying both at once, in varying degrees. But don't let that worry you. Landings and takeoffs are largely a combination of other abilities which you will have learned previously. For example, you can't make good landings or takeoffs until you know how to handle the plane on the ground as well as in the air. So you first learn to taxi. At the outset, make sure that you have your seat as high as you can get it and still have full throw of the rudder pedals. If you're not very tall, you may have to use a cushion behind your back so you can comfortably operate the rudder pedals. If it seems necessary, don't hesitate to use the cushion. It'll be supplied to you upon request. Your heels rest on the deck when you're flying, taking off, or landing. But when you're taxiing, have your feet well up on the pedals so you can easily operate the brakes by pressing forward with the ball of your foot. When every detail of your cockpit check is completed and you're ready to leave the line, adjust your goggles, glance at the tower for flag or light signals to be sure you're clear to taxi out, and unlock your tail wheel. With your throttle at idling, the stick back, and your brakes full on, give your plane captain the thumbs-up signal to remove the wheel shocks. Now watch your plane captain and follow his signals. He will guide you out onto the taxi strip. When the plane captain does this, he means come ahead. This means turn in the direction he is pointing, that is, to your left. So, of course, this means turn to your right. This means hold your left brake for a sharp left turn. And when he does this, he wants you to hold your right brake for a sharp right turn. This motion means slow down. Here, he's telling you to stop. Here to stop where you are, or as quickly as possible. Your plane captain is there to help you. Follow his signals except when, in your judgment, they're in error. Bear in mind that you are at all times responsible for your airplane and for any damage it may cause to personnel or equipment, regardless of signals from the plane captain. There's nothing especially difficult about taxiing. But strangely enough, the majority of accidents in primary training happen on the ground. So one quick way to get into trouble is improper taxiing.
Cadet McDribble, sir.
Oh, yes, McDribble. You know, we like to talk things over with you fellows occasionally to see how you're getting along.
Yes, sir.
As a matter of fact, I just had a problem come up. I'd like to ask your opinion on it.
Yes, sir.
Got a couple of pictures here. What sort of disciplinary action do you think you should be subjected to, McDribble?
Well, very severe, sir.
Yes. Here's another one. Going too fast. Had to stop quickly. Stepped on his brakes too hard. What would you think of a cadet who did that, McDribble?
Well, very unfortunate, sir.
Would you like to know who was responsible for these accidents?
Yes, sir.
Cadet Sylvester McDribble.
Yes, sir.
McDribble, you apparently aren't aware of the importance of taxiing correctly. We discussed these accidents at the time they happened. Now you're on report again. According to this, you are guilty of taxiing too fast, failing to S-turn, not keeping your hands on the controls, and not watching where you're going. Also, on the 9th of the month, as you left the line, you held your brakes and applied unnecessary throttle, working brakes against throttle in such a way that your prop blast blew cowling and other loose gear about, endangering personnel and equipment. I believe you suggested severe disciplinary action, did you not, McDribble?
Well, yes, sir.
Very well. We will endeavor to follow your suggestion.
Yes, you can get into a lot of trouble through improper taxiing. But let's go back again to the point where you're ready to leave the line. Be sure your tail wheel is unlocked. Then give it a little throttle to start it rolling. And incidentally, when taxiing, as when flying, keep your hand on the throttle at all times. Let the plane roll straight ahead for a couple of feet because it's much easier to start a turn when the plane is moving. A good pilot takes pride in using a minimum of throttle for leaving the line and for taxiing. In getting out of a tight spot requiring sharp turns, you use full rudder, applying brake intermittently as necessary, and using moderate blast from the throttle to help push the tail around. But take throttle off again the instant you don't need it, thereby avoiding Mac's mistake of using too much throttle and holding the plane back with too much brake. And wherever possible, avoid holding the brake steadily, because this locks the wheel, twisting the tire, and grinding off the tread rubber. Using the brakes intermittently will get you around almost as sharply and will allow both wheels to turn, thus saving the tire. In all taxiing, remember that your brakes are a delicate mechanism and wear out quickly. Save them for the time when you really need them. Under normal conditions, taxiing speed should not be faster than a brisk walk. And in congested areas, it may have to be even slower. The only way you can see what's ahead of you is to S-turn. And here's a tip on S-turn. Under normal conditions, as soon as the turn starts, start stopping it. Suppose you're beginning a turn to the right. As soon as the turn is started, you apply full left rudder. Then, if you're still turning to the right when you want to start back the other way, help the turn with a little left brake, applying brake lightly and using only as much as is necessary. Control your speed and help your turns with the throttle, using brakes only when necessary. If for some reason you get yourself into an emergency situation where you have to slow down suddenly, be careful about applying both brakes at once. It's much safer to apply them this way. On your brakes and find them ineffective, try pumping them. They're hydraulic brakes and react much the same as the hydraulic brakes on an automobile. Also, under normal wind conditions, keep your stick back. If you carry the stick in a forward position, the prop blast may tend to lift the tail, particularly if you have to stop suddenly. This is especially true if you're taxiing into a wind, because then you have the strength of the wind plus the prop blast trying to lift the tail. But with the stick back, both the headwind and the prop blast tend to push the tail down instead of up. In taxiing with the wind behind you, keep your stick in about the neutral position to minimize the chances of your tail being lifted either by the prop blast from ahead or the tailwind from behind. And taxi slowly. If you're taxiing in a strong crosswind with the wind coming from somewhere on your right, it will attempt to lift your right wing, so put your stick over to the right to help hold down your right wing. In other words, put your stick into the wind. If the wind is on your left, you put your stick to the left, into the wind, helping to hold the left wing down. On the ground, the airplane is like a weather vane. It wants to turn into the wind. For example, if you're taxiing in an easterly direction and there is a brisk wind from the north, the plane wants to turn to the north. So if you want to taxi in a strong crosswind, you get the plane turned onto the course you want it to follow and then lock the tail wheel. This will help a lot in keeping the plane from turning into the wind. Then when you want to turn off this given course, naturally you must again unlock the tail wheel. And here a word of warning. Many a student and occasionally an experienced pilot come to grief when taxiing behind parked planes because someone unexpectedly started to test his mags. A plane will weathercock into a slipstream just as it will weathercock into the wind. So if you must taxi behind other planes, be on the lookout for this sort of thing. When you come to the edge of the takeoff and landing area, look around for incoming planes. Planes landing always have the right-of-way, so never cross the landing or takeoff mat or strip without first looking around carefully for incoming traffic. taxi out to your takeoff position. Just before you turn onto your takeoff heading, look down the field to be sure your takeoff path is clear. And look to the other side for landing planes. Then swing smartly around into position so you're headed exactly down the specified takeoff course. Roll ahead a few feet, straighten the tail wheel, and lock it. If there's a takeoff line on the mat from which you're taking off, don't crowd it in your turn. Make your turn into takeoff position wide enough so you have room to complete the turn and roll ahead a few feet to straighten your tail wheel without crossing the line. Drop your seat down into flying position so when you look along the top of the fuselage, you are also looking through the center of the windscreen. And drop your heels to the deck. Check the tower quickly for light signals and be sure the course flag is up. Take a last look behind you for incoming planes. Then advance throttle smoothly and positively all the way forward. But let's stop right here for a moment to emphasize the importance of getting off the ground as quickly as you safely can. For example, here sits Cadet McDribble casually carrying out his cockpit check, which he should have completed before leaving the line, and holding up a whole flight by creating a traffic jam like Saturday night on Main Street. But if you get everything all set before you ever taxi away from the line, then when you do get to the takeoff position, you have only to follow this simple routine. Look for incoming traffic. Glance at your takeoff path. Swing around into position and roll ahead a few feet. Lock your tail wheel, drop your seat to the flying position, and your heels to the deck. Glance at the tower, and the very last thing, look back once more to be sure there's no danger of collision with landing planes. Then advance the throttle smoothly and positively all the way forward. One other precaution at this point. Don't snap the throttle forward. Here's what may happen to you if you do. In an emergency where you suddenly needed power badly, that could be very serious. And more important, sudden application of throttle will give you a lot of torque suddenly and at slow speeds, which may cause you to swerve or even to ground loop. So get in the habit of smooth, positive application of throttle. You will feel the effects of torque in any case when you apply throttle for the takeoff. So be on the lookout for any tendency to swerve to the left. As you begin your takeoff run, keep your tail firmly on the ground, and the locked tail wheel will help keep you straight. Then, as you begin to pick up speed and your controls become more effective, ease the nose down into the takeoff attitude. And once you have that attitude, simply hold it until the plane becomes airborne. In that attitude, it's bound to fly as soon as you have enough speed. Once you're off the ground, continue to hold your takeoff attitude until the plane has plenty of lift and buoyancy, and you can safely ease the nose up a little into the normal climbing position. When you're sure of clearing all obstacles and have passed the boundaries of the field, smoothly retard throttle to the climbing setting to save your engine. But don't be in too much of a hurry to retard the throttle, and don't bring it back any further than the three-quarters position. After you're beyond the boundaries of the field and at a safe altitude, which is usually about 200 feet above the ground, begin a climbing turn in whichever direction the course rules call for. One of the most important things to be learned in connection with a takeoff is to keep the path of the airplane absolutely straight. From the standpoint of safety, a straight takeoff is important right from the start. The pilot who allows his plane to swerve risks a collision, and since takeoff collisions are too close to the ground for a parachute jump, they're often fatal. In that part of the takeoff run during which you're on the ground, you keep the plane straight with your rudder. You'll have to use quite a lot of rudder at first, but as speed picks up, you'll need less and less until you have flying speed and become airborne. In the takeoff, as in virtually all of flying, you have to see several different things at once. You look well ahead of the airplane so that you always have before you a complete picture of the scenery on either side of the nose. Not just the ground down close, but all the scenery clear up to the horizon and above. By watching the nose in relation to the scenery, you can tell whether or not the plane is swerving. If the nose does not move to one side or the other over the scenery, then you're going straight. In this next takeoff, we're going to deliberately allow the plane to swerve. By watching the scenery in relation to the nose, you can tell which way the plane is swerving. Another important factor in both landings and takeoffs is keeping the wings level. Notice in this takeoff that our right wing is slightly lower than the left. So as soon as we become airborne, we begin to turn. A wing low takeoff means we either turn or slip upon becoming airborne. At this stage of your training, either one can be very dangerous. Another common mistake in the takeoff is getting the nose down too low. As the plane picks up speed, you should bring the nose down to about this attitude. But if you push it down too far, like this, for example, you will needlessly prolong your takeoff run. A nose-low takeoff attitude might give you a takeoff path something like this. Contrast that with the takeoff path made by a plane using the correct takeoff attitude. So, under normal conditions, the correct takeoff attitude gives you a shorter takeoff run and more altitude in less time. But let's look at the other extreme to see what happens when you try to take off with the nose too high. Suppose instead of bringing the nose down to this position, you only brought it down to here. In that case, the plane would pull up too sharply and would probably stall, bouncing you back onto the ground. Also, as we pointed out previously, when a plane is ready to fly, you need only to raise the nose slightly to help it off the ground. Even though you have assumed the correct takeoff attitude, if you raise the nose too sharply, or if you bring it up too high, you will probably cause the plane to stall, so it again bounces you back onto the ground. Still another common mistake is made by the student who gets the plane into the air correctly, raising the nose just the right amount, but fails to hold the takeoff attitude and allows the wheels to touch the ground again. So once you have it off the ground, hold it off. And except under unusual conditions, hold the nose in that same attitude until you have picked up enough speed so it's safe to ease up into a climb. Get the plane in the correct climbing attitude, which has already been demonstrated, then trim it for that attitude. And one other precaution which we haven't mentioned, when you're ready to make your climbing turn, look back first on the side toward which you're going to turn. In fact, never make a turn anywhere without looking first. As in the case of the takeoff, you already know most of the fundamentals of landing the airplane. The wing level power-off stall, which was previously demonstrated, is an integral part of the power-off landing. In executing this stall, you will remember that we first cut the throttle and assume a glide. Then we ease the nose up slowly so that the stick is all the way back and the plane in the three-point attitude at the instant the stall occurs. And that's exactly what you do when you land a plane, except you so plan the glide and the stall that the plane is within inches of the ground at the instant the stall occurs, and all three wheels hit the ground at approximately the same instant. We want the plane to be traveling as slowly as possible when it hits the ground from the standpoint of safety, and because the slower it is traveling when it lands, the shorter its landing run will be. Also, you want the plane to hit the ground on all 3 points. Why? Well, for the same reason you don't put 2 legs on a 3-legged stool. 3 points give you more stability and safety. Also, you want to get used to how the plane looks on the ground, the position of the nose in relation to the horizon, because that is the landing attitude. When you're breaking your glide and the plane reaches that attitude, it is stalling and therefore should also be landing. We use the gliding approach to a power-off landing, but we don't want to land at gliding speed. It's much too fast for that. So we slow the plane up. How? By easing the nose up out of the gliding attitude. But slowing up the plane means that the air flows less rapidly over the wings, and that, in turn, cuts down lift. So as we bring the nose up, the plane continues to follow a downward path, even though the nose is steadily rising. The direction the nose is pointed is getting further and further from the direction the plane is traveling, until finally the air can no longer flow smoothly over the wings to form the low-pressure area. So the plane stalls and lands at the same time. Thus it lands at the slowest possible speed. And it is so designed that, properly handled, the stall occurs at the same time the plane is in the 3-point attitude. A bird lands that same way. It uses the gliding approach, then brings its nose up smoothly to slow down its glide. Finally, it settles to a landing at the same instant its wings stall, and thus it lands at the slowest possible speed. Also, a bird lands and takes off into the wind. And so, whenever possible, does an airplane. Supposing we're using this field for our landing practice, we must first determine the direction of the wind. Some fields have a wind T to indicate the direction the wind is coming from. Some have a tetrahedron. This field, it so happens, has a windsock. So, having determined the direction the wind is coming from, we try to visualize the direction of the wind in relation to the field. Obviously, we can't land directly into the wind unless we have the wind direction well in mind. The power-off approach to a landing begins with the plane headed at right angles to the landing line at an altitude of 500 feet. At about this point, we cut the throttle, assume a glide, and start a turn in toward the field. Also, we trim the plane to help us hold the correct gliding attitude and speed. As we approach the new heading, we start to roll out of the turn so that when the wings are level, we are headed directly into the wind. With our heading established, we must now keep the plane absolutely straight. To do this, we look well ahead, watching the nose in relation to the scenery to see that it doesn't swerve to one side or the other. We want to keep it exactly on heading. And, just as important, the wings must be level and must remain level. Try to see the whole picture, your wings and your nose, in relation to all the scenery within your range of vision and in relation to the horizon. Don't concentrate on any one thing. Divide your attention and see everything at once. Now, somewhere along here, we begin to ease the nose up, breaking the glide and slowing down the speed of the plane. As the nose eases up gradually, you can hear the plane getting slower. There's less pressure on the controls. It continues to slow down and settle so that it stalls in the 3-point attitude with the stick all the way back just a few inches off the ground. One of the common mistakes made by beginning students is handling the plane too roughly. For example, the glide must be broken gradually and the nose eased up slowly. If you pull the nose up too fast, the result is a ballooning effect. Watch. Instead of continuing to settle, the plane actually pulls away from the ground. Not only does ballooning foul up your landing, but it also involves the risk of stalling the plane too high above the ground and bouncing you hard, or making it necessary for the instructor to take over to prevent an accident. But poorly controlled gliding speed can also cause you to balloon. We'll demonstrate. You can tell by the way this glide looks and sounds. We're in just about the right gliding attitude. The steady sound of the wind and the rigging remains at the same pitch, so you know your speed is constant. Now let's let the nose wander down too low for the correct gliding attitude. The hum of the wind goes into higher pitch. You can tell we're picking up speed. Listen. Now, when we get ready to break our glide, even though we pull the nose up very slowly, the plane balloons. Instead of settling, it pulls up away from the ground. However, if you recognize the fact that you have too much speed, you can often land the airplane anyway, providing you have enough landing room. Instead of bringing the nose up into the three-point attitude, you merely ease it up into the level flight attitude, leveling off within a foot or two of the ground. Then you allow the plane to float until it loses its excess speed and you can land it. Once you level off and begin to lose speed, the plane will want to drop so the front wheels hit the ground. But you hold the plane off by gradually easing the nose up toward the three-point attitude. You continue slowly easing the nose up so the plane is in the three-point attitude with the stick all the way back at the moment the plane stalls and lands. But floating on a landing is merely a correction to get rid of excess speed, which you probably should never have acquired in the first place. The ideal landing is the landing you make out of a glide. There is no leveling off. The nose is pulled up steadily, smoothly, and continuously. There is no float, no ballooning. We mentioned a moment ago the importance of keeping the plane absolutely straight into the wind. Aside from the danger of collision with other planes, if the wind is of any strength, here's what may happen when you allow the plane to swerve off the wind line. Also, we emphasize the importance of keeping the wings level. Many students show a tendency to drop one wing or the other as they bring the nose up in breaking their glide. Like this. One wing down means you're either swerving or slipping. You land on one wheel, which again involves the risk of ground looping. Another very common mistake beginning students make in landings is landing the plane too high. This can happen in either one of two ways. The student starts to break his glide while he is still too high off the ground, so that when he reaches a three-point attitude and stalls, the ground is not there to catch him. The plane either has a considerable drop and lands very hard, or the instructor has to take over. Or a student will often land the plane high by breaking his glide too fast. That is, not fast enough to make the plane balloon, but fast enough so the plane slows down and is through flying before it has time to settle to the ground. The opposite of that, of course, is landing the plane too low, sometimes called flying it into the ground. So the front wheels hit the ground before the plane has reached the three-point attitude. This also can be caused by two different types of mistake. Either by breaking the glide too late, so there isn't time to bring the nose up into the three-point attitude before the wheels hit the ground, or even though the student starts breaking his glide early enough, he may still make the mistake of flying the plane into the ground by bringing his nose up so slowly that the wheels hit the ground before the plane has reached the three-point attitude. Some students get the idea that there is a specific point or altitude at which they must always break their glide. But this is not the case. There is quite a space in the lower part of your gliding approach during which the glide may be broken. Within limits, it is not so much a case of where you break your glide as how fast you break it. For example, if you start to break your glide high, but bring the nose up slowly enough, continuously coordinating attitude with altitude, you can make a good landing despite the fact that you started to break your glide high. If, on the other hand, you start to break the glide low, but bring the nose up rapidly, although not so fast as to make the plane balloon, you can again make a good landing despite the fact that you started to break the glide low. Landing the plane is strictly a matter of sight, sound, and pressures. You have to feel it in. You have to train your senses so that you know exactly how far you've progressed toward the stall so that you'll know just when to land the plane. In order to know these things, you must be relaxed but alert. If you're all tensed up, you can't feel what the airplane wants to do. It's perfectly natural that you may tend to tense up on your first few landings. But the sooner you can counteract that tendency, the sooner you'll be able to land the airplane and take it off successfully. And whatever you do, avoid the mistake of our friend McDribble, who believes that the landing is completed once he has the plane on the ground. are two things to remember about handling the plane after it is on the ground. Keep the tail firmly on the ground by keeping the stick all the way back. And keep the plane straight. When you've slowed down to approximately taxiing speed, put your feet up on the pedal so you'll be ready with the brakes in case you need them. But keep the plane rolling straight clear to the edge of the takeoff and landing area so you won't get in the way of other planes which may be landing or taking off near you. Raise your seat for taxiing, unlock your tail wheel, and before you turn, look back on the side towards which you're going to turn so you won't cut into anyone. We've shown you the elements that go to make up a landing. These elements are very much like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. You have to get them all together before you can make good landings. There'll probably be times during your early training when you'll wonder if you'll ever learn to land the plane. Then, suddenly one day, you'll get all the pieces together as they should be, and you'll make a good landing. And then another, and you'll have it. But whatever you do to make landings and all flying easier for you right from the start, try to make full use of your eyes, your ears, the pressures the controls give back to your hands and feet, and the pressures on the seat of your pants. Landing begins with an approach. The approach brings you into position to land. If it is a good approach, it brings you right to the spot where you want to set down. But before going any further with approaches in an airplane, let us simulate one or two approach problems in an automobile. Traveling along this straightaway, we get the car up to some established speed, say 35 miles an hour. The problem is to cut the engine at just the right point, so that with the car in neutral and without using brakes, we will roll to a stop just on the other side of the line. Needless to say, to do that without a lot of practice would be the neatest trick of the week. But we can make the problem a lot easier if we bend our approach path around so we make a 90-degree turn onto the final leg of our approach. Now suppose that after cutting the throttle, we find we're slowing down too fast. We simply turn in sooner, varying our rate of turn so we end up just over the line. On the other hand, suppose that after cutting the throttle, we find we have too much speed. In that case, we delay turning in, and then turn in gradually, using up as much speed as possible in the turn to avoid overshooting. We can make 100 variations in where we start the turn and in the rate of turn. And if we were to straighten out these various paths, we would see that each variation actually changes the distance the car travels. So we can compensate for a shortage of speed by turning in sooner and cutting down the distance we travel. Or we can use up an excess of speed by delaying our turn and increasing the distance we travel. Now let us replace the automobile with an airplane and the lines with the edges of a landing field. We put the airplane into about the same approach position as we did the automobile, but at an altitude of 500 feet. And we cut the throttle. The problem is similar to the approach problem with the automobile, except now it is altitude we are dissipating, not speed. The gliding speed we keep constant. If we find we're getting too low, that is, if we are running out of altitude, we turn in early, carrying our rate of turn as necessary to bring us in comfortably in the first third of the field. But if we find we're not losing altitude fast enough, and it looks like we're in danger of overshooting, we delay turning in, using up our excess altitude by traveling the maximum distance and landing on the far side of the field. Or we can turn in and land anywhere between these two extremes, depending on whether we are short of altitude or have excess altitude we must get rid of. In the 90-degree approach, as in most flying, one of the greatest variables is the effect of the wind. That is, the movement of the air. This movement of the air affects the plane like the current of a river affects a boat. If we start across the river with the nose of the boat pointed straight for the opposite bank, we will move across like this, ending up some distance downstream from the point at which we aimed. To understand more fully just why the current has this effect on the boat, let us substitute a moving belt for the river, a very wide belt which moves along through the countryside just like the river. If we drive a car across the belt, following a line running straight across it, the car will appear to be moving diagonally across the belt, and we will end up here. Actually, we have driven the car straight across, following the line, but the motion of the belt has moved the path itself and the car with it. If we want to go to a point directly across the belt, we will have to follow a course like this, so that by the time we reach the end of the course, the belt will have moved the end of the course down to our desired destination. An airplane, as long as it is in contact with the ground, is affected by the wind blowing on it. But as soon as it is clear of the ground, the plane moves with the air. The air carries it along just as the moving belt carries the car or the water carries a boat. For instance, suppose we want to travel a course like this, from south to north, and the wind is from the west. If we head directly for the point we want to reach, we will end up away to the east of it. We will have flown a straight course through the air, but the air moving over the earth from west to east will move the entire flight path, so our path over the ground will be a diagonal one. However, if we point our nose off to the northwest on a diagonal heading into the wind, our flight path through the air will be diagonal, but our track over the ground will be straight to our objective. Let's see how this works out in actual practice. The plane below us is attempting to parallel that highway. But even though its nose is pointed straight along the highway, the plane is moving off to the right. By making a turn so that we bring the nose around somewhat into the direction the wind is coming from, we can make a track over the ground which parallels the highway perfectly. This is called correction for drift by crabbing, or drift angle correction. And when you crab, your wings are level. You are flying in normal, balanced flight. It's just that you're flying this way while the wind is drifting you this way. So you end up on a compromise course between the two. And you adjust your heading so the compromise course is just the course you want to follow. If you find you are moving over to the windward of the course you want to fly, you're crabbing too much, so turn back slightly. If you find yourself drifting downwind off your course, you're not crabbing enough, so turn a little more into the wind. But let's go back to the moving belt for a moment. Suppose we were to drive a car along the belt at exactly 30 miles per hour. At the end of 1 hour, the car will have traveled exactly 30 miles over the belt. But let us suppose that at the same time, the belt was also moving at the rate, let us say, of 20 miles per hour. So while the automobile was traveling 30 miles, the belt was traveling 20. And even though the car has traveled only 30 miles by means of its own power, it has covered a total distance of 50 miles in relation to the surrounding countryside. An airplane flying at the rate of 75 miles per hour will travel 75 miles through the air in 1 hour's time. But suppose that at the same time, the air is also moving in the same direction at the rate of 25 miles per hour. Then during the hour, the plane is moving 75 miles. The body of air in which the plane is flying will have moved an additional 25 miles. So the plane will have traveled 100 miles in relation to the ground. On the other hand, if the plane is flying in the opposite direction from the way the air is moving, while the airplane is flying 75 miles through the air, The air itself would be moving 25 miles in the opposite direction. So at the end of an hour, the plane would have traveled only 50 miles in relation to the ground. Again, suppose you put your plane into a climb, and in 10 minutes' time you gain 3,000 feet of altitude and travel a distance of 10 miles through the air. But suppose also that the air is moving in the same direction at such a rate that the body of air in which your plane is flying will have moved an additional 5 miles. Thus, your plane would travel 15 miles in relation to the ground. But the gain in altitude is exactly the same, regardless of the movement of the air. On the other hand, if you are flying in the opposite direction, while you are traveling a distance of 10 miles through the air and gaining 3,000 feet of altitude, the body of air will have moved you back 5 miles, so you will have traveled only 5 miles in relation to the ground. But again, your gain in altitude will be exactly the same, 3,000 feet in 10 minutes. Contrary to the popular misconception, you do not gain altitude faster when climbing upwind. You gain exactly the same amount of altitude in a given period of time, and your climbing altitude is the same whether you are climbing upwind or downwind or in no wind at all. The only thing that varies is the distance you travel over the ground. So in flying an airplane, you must deal with two different kinds of speed. Airspeed, or the speed with which the plane travels through the air, and ground speed, or the speed at which the plane travels in relation to the ground. Assuming that it takes 50 knots airspeed to get off the ground in a takeoff, if you take off downwind in a 20-knot wind, you will be moving at a ground speed of 70 knots when you become airborne. To get this much ground speed, you will have to have a much longer takeoff run. You will have less altitude in a given distance, and therefore less chance of clearing obstacles at the end of the runway. But if you take off into a 20-knot wind, even though you must still have 50 knots airspeed to get off the ground, you will become airborne at a ground speed of only 30 knots. You can pick up 30 knots ground speed in a hurry, shortening your takeoff run and giving you much more altitude with which to clear obstacles in a given distance over the ground. Now let us apply this information on the effect of the wind on the plane to the 90-degree power-off approach. Like most Navy approach patterns, this one, in its complete form, approximates a racetrack pattern. We take off from the practice field and climb straight ahead until we have cleared the edge of the field and have enough altitude to safely begin a climbing turn. We make the climbing turn in whichever direction is called for by the course rules. Climb to an altitude of 500 feet above the ground, level off, and fly downwind until we are approximately opposite the downwind end of the field. Here we enter a turn, which we plan in such a way as to bring us into the 90-degree position. But here again, the wind, that is the movement of the air, will affect virtually every phase of the pattern in much the same way that the current of a river would affect a boat attempting to make such a pattern. The boat leaves the dock headed directly into the current. But if the helmsman pays no attention to drift, that is, if he makes his turn as though there were no current, he will make this kind of pattern. Likewise, in the down current turn, if he forgets about drift, he will end up with a completely unsymmetrical pattern and a long pull upstream to make the dock. To make the kind of pattern he wants, he must make the upstream turn more gradual. On the downstream end, he must turn more sharply. And the pilot must do exactly that same thing if he is to make an acceptable approach pattern. Practically speaking, the first problem the student must deal with in making an approach is that of joining the traffic pattern. Let's follow this plane as it prepares to join traffic for an approach to a practice field.
Okay, let me take it for a while. If you'll look ahead and slightly to the right, you'll see a practice field. We want to land at that field. But before we join the traffic pattern, we must know the direction of the wind. As a matter of fact, there's something you should be conscious of every second you're in the air. Smoke is probably the best wind indicator. You can almost always see smoke somewhere. Wind thin streaks on water are a good wind indicator. So are grain fields and trees or windmills. When you know the direction of the wind, you can tell which is the upwind end of the traffic pattern. You have to know this because that's where you enter traffic. If you're back here at, say, 1,000 feet, you'd be able to plan ahead, letting down to the required altitude, 500 feet in this case. At the same time, you're maneuvering to enter traffic. From this point, you can enter traffic anywhere along the upwind end of the traffic pattern, but you must enter at a shallow angle to the direction of flow of traffic. If you were approaching the field from out in this direction, you would circle the field, staying wide until you were down to 500 feet and in position to enter traffic at the upwind end of the pattern. Or suppose you were approaching the field from out here. Instead of going clear around the field, you can make a wide turn, bringing you into position to enter the pattern at a shallow angle at the upwind end of the pattern. As we get closer to the field, you can get a better look at the planes already in the traffic pattern. After takeoff, they climb out of the field at the upwind end. They have the right-of-way. It's up to you to get space between the planes already in the pattern, so you won't interfere with them or they with you. For instance, here you have one plane climbing out of the field and another one landing. By turning out a little to give the first plane a chance to get ahead of you, you can get yourself comfortably spaced between the two. Once in the pattern, you have plenty to think about. First, keep the plane at an altitude of 500 feet above the ground, but not by staring at the altimeter. Merely glance at it occasionally and make the necessary adjustment in the attitude of your nose. Holding altitude is a matter of constant correction. Your principal problem in the 90-degree approach is to get yourself into a favorable position for cutting your throttle. For instance, suppose you make your upwind turn too sharp so you're too close to the field on the downwind leg. Unless you make some correction, you'll be here when you cut your throttle. To lose your altitude, you'll have to glide clear over to the far edge of the field. If you turn in any sooner, you'll overshoot badly. So when you make this kind of pattern, you're limiting your possible landing area to a narrow strip along the far edge of the field. You're liable to get fouled up with traffic, and you're allowing yourself almost no opportunity for corrections. On the other hand, if you make your upwind turn too shallow and do not make some correction, you will be here when you cut your throttle. And if you're lucky, you'll just make the field. Again, you're limiting your landing area to a narrow strip, this time on the near side of the field, because you simply don't have enough altitude to glide any further. But suppose you get yourself spaced correctly on your downwind leg and you're doing fine until you start your turn too soon. Unless you make a correction, you'll be at this point when you close your throttle, much too close to the field. You'll have to use up your altitude by gliding along parallel to the field, bringing you down clear over on the far side, and again limiting your available landing area to a narrow strip. The reverse of this, another common mistake, results from starting your turn too late, so you cut your throttle here. If you're going to make the field at all, you'll have to turn in sharply and head straight for it. But to a considerable extent, learning to fly is a matter of learning to recognize your mistakes and correct them in time. If you turn too sharply at the upwind end of the pattern, make a correction by widening out on the downwind leg to bring you into a favorable position at the 90-degree point. If you've made your upwind turn too wide, slice in on the downwind leg. Your first objective in the 90-degree approach is to get yourself into a favorable 90-degree position which makes it possible for you to take advantage of the entire field in making corrections as you glide in for a landing. But this 90-degree position varies with the strength of the wind. For example, suppose there is a strong wind. Then, while you're gliding in for your landing, the air will at the same time be moving you back away from the field. You will not travel as far over the ground during your descent. So from this 90-degree point, you would probably undershoot the field altogether. Or suppose there's practically no wind at all. You would then travel much further over the ground in your glide. And even though you turn very gradually, gliding clear to the far edge of the field, you would very likely overshoot the field altogether. So your 90-degree position varies with the strength of the wind. When there's a brisk wind, the pattern shrinks. The 90-degree position is closer in. On a calm day, the pattern expands, and the 90-degree position moves out, further away from the field. But each approach is different. The wind changes from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour. There are vertical winds, that is, updrafts and downdrafts, as well as winds over the ground. These vary your rate of descent. So once you have established a pattern and cut your throttle at the 90-degree point, watch the field. Pick a point where you think you can land. If it looks like you're coming down pretty rapidly, turn in a little. Anytime it looks like you're going to be too high to hit the spot you've picked, widen out your pattern. Keep experimenting. Vary your rate of turn. Playing rate of turn against altitude. One of the principal purposes of this maneuver is to develop your ability to judge your rate of descent and make corrections accordingly. And incidentally, be sure to recover from your turn before crossing the edge of the field. You should have a reasonable amount of straightaway before you land. You'll notice that while we were making that landing, the windsock has swung around so the direction of the wind runs diagonally across the field. Now it becomes more important than ever that you visualize a landing line. Pick a couple of points, a clump of trees perhaps, and one corner of the field, and imagine a line between them which parallels the direction of the wind and can serve as a landing line. Then your entire approach pattern is built around that landing line. Your downwind leg parallels your landing line. You begin your downwind turn when you are abeam of the spot where you intend to land, and you cut your throttle when you're 90 degrees to your landing line. Now try to visualize your possible landing area. Obviously, you can't land here or here. There isn't enough room. But you do have a large area on either side of the landing line where you can sit down. By selecting a landing line in the center of your landing area, you give yourself the longest possible landing line and the maximum opportunity for correction on either side of it. The racetrack pattern and the 90-degree approach are the beginning of all pattern flying. In this maneuver, you learn merely to hit a field without power. Next, you'll be able to hit a runway with power. Then pretty soon, you'll be hitting a 200-foot circle from 800 feet. And it won't be long after that before you'll learn to get into a very small field from a cut gun at 1,000 feet. All in preparation for the time when you may have to make a power approach to the rolling pitching deck of a moving carrier, or a jungle strip barely long enough for your landing run, and more than likely out of the wind. The racetrack pattern and the 90-degree approach are the first steps toward all that, toward developing your ability to visualize a flight path through the air and apply that exact path so you can make the plane do precisely what you want it to do and set it down on a dime. Okay, let's go home.
Controls locked. Gas off, switch off, controls locked.
All right, you got any questions you'd like to ask? Anything you're not quite clear about?
Well, sir, there's just one thing. Is there any way to gauge how far your downwind leg should be from your landing line? I mean, well, the way I understand it, if it's a windy day, your you're at the 90-degree point. Or if it's a calm day, you're out wider.
That's right.
But this downwind leg, how far out should it be?
Well, far enough so that you can make a smooth turn, which will put you in a good 90-degree position. But close enough in so that you're always within easy gliding distance of your field from any point along your downwind leg. And that holds true of all racetrack pattern approaches. See, the entire pattern is based on safety. Your climbing turn after takeoff should be a relatively shallow turn because you must gain enough altitude during the turn so you're at least 400 feet above the ground by the time you're headed back on your downwind leg. You should be so spaced here that if your engine cut out on you, you could turn and glide into the field crosswind. Then very shortly you'll have your full 500 feet and should be able to land somewhat more into the wind. Continuing along the downwind leg, you should soon be able to land directly into the wind. So if your downwind leg is the right distance away from the field, you can glide into the field from any point along it.
But, sir, I don't really know when I'm within gliding distance of the field.
No, but you soon will. The 90-degree approach will help you learn to judge gliding distances. So will other maneuvers that you'll get later on. On our next hop, we're going to start work on the 180-degree power-on approach. This is similar to the 90-degree approach, except that you start your descent here, abeam of the landing spot. You control your rate of descent by varying combinations of throttle and attitude.
You come in with power on?
That's right. And that involves something which is sometimes referred to as slow flight. So the first thing we'll do tomorrow is to go up high and find out some of the things you can do with a plane by varying combinations of power and attitude. For instance, suppose we start with a plane in straight and level flight at cruising throttle. If we add throttle, the nose wants to rise, causing us to gain altitude. But if we deliberately hold the plane in the same straight attitude, we gain altitude. The only way to keep the plane from gaining altitude when we're using more than cruising throttle is to tilt the nose down. If we tilt it down just the right amount for the added throttle we have on, we can maintain a constant altitude. But let's go back to cruising throttle again and ease the nose back up to the level attitude. Now, suppose we want to slow the plane down. First, we retard the throttle somewhat. When we do this, the nose wants to go down, causing us to lose altitude. If we deliberately hold the plane in the same level attitude we started with, as soon as the speed falls off, we'll start to lose altitude. If we want to maintain the same altitude and still travel at a slower speed, we'll have to tilt the nose up. The slower the speed, the higher the nose will have to be if we're to maintain altitude, up to the point where the plane stalls. Now we're in slow flight, that is, slower than gliding speed, but with the plane safely under control and not too close to a stall. You see, with power on, most planes will fly a little more slowly without stalling. Notice the position of the nose and wings in relation to the horizon. Get used to the sound and feel of slow flight. Now, suppose we want to lose altitude and still keep power on. We take the throttle back still further. At this point, you must be doubly conscious of the feel of the airplane. Don't let it get too slow or too fast. If it seems to be getting too slow, ease the nose down a little. If the plane seems to be picking up speed, ease the nose up a little. If you want to lose altitude faster, take off still more throttle. And, if necessary, ease the nose down slightly to maintain speed. If you want to slow down your rate of descent or stop it altogether, add throttle. You see, in a power letdown, that's what we call this method of losing altitude, you're working with 4 factors. 2 of them you control directly. The attitude of the plane you control with elevators, ailerons, and rudder. The power you control with the throttle. What you do with attitude and power determines your airspeed and rate of descent. Forgetting, of course, about convection currents and other air conditions like that. If you change one of these without changing the other, you change both airspeed and rate of descent. But if you change attitude and power in the proper relationship to each other, you can vary your rate of descent and keep your airspeed constant. Or you can vary your airspeed and keep your rate of descent constant. So, you see, it's a matter of coordinating attitude and power. In a power-off glide, you have one correct attitude, one throttle setting, and therefore one airspeed and one rate of descent. In a power letdown, you have your choice of a whole range of attitudes and throttle settings, permitting you to maintain a safe but well-controlled airspeed while getting the exact rate of descent that you want. Now let's apply slow flight in the power letdown to the 180-degree power approach. You remember the 90-degree approach. We cut the throttle at the 90-degree point, and we get to land anywhere in the first third of the field. In the 180-degree power-on approach, we must hit a specific predetermined landing spot, and we must approach the landing spot on a predetermined landing line. But we use throttle in varying amounts all the way down. On the downwind leg, we get the plane well slowed down. Then at the abeam point, we begin to lose altitude, adjusting rate of descent and rate of turn to set us down on the predetermined landing spot. In actual practice, the upwind half of the 180-degree pattern is the same as the 90-degree pattern until you're about halfway along the downwind leg. By this time, you have your 500 feet of altitude, and you're in straight and level cruising flight. Your problem now is to slow the plane down. This you do by retarding throttle to a point well back of the cruising setting and gradually raising your nose to the slow flight attitude. Get your speed down to less than gliding speed, but with the plane comfortably under control and not too close to a stall. Raise or lower your nose as necessary to keep this speed constant. And if you start to lose altitude, add a little throttle. You must keep your 500 feet of altitude until you reach a point abeam of your landing spot. Meanwhile, of course, be sure that you're flying a course parallel to your imaginary landing line. And while you're flying this downwind leg, pick the spot you want to land on. When you're abeam of your landing spot, you begin your descent by taking off still more throttle. At the same time you do this, begin a gentle turn and ease your nose down a little, or up, as necessary to keep your airspeed from getting too slow or too fast. Your attention must be divided, but you will want to keep a fairly constant watch on your landing spot. If it looks like you're going to overshoot it, take off more throttle. If it looks like you're losing altitude too fast, add a little throttle to slow down your rate of descent. Plan your rate of turn so you recover to straight flight before you cross the edge of the field, so you'll have plenty of time to get squared away on your landing line. You're probably already in a nose-high attitude at this point, so you have only to bring the nose up a little to reach the landing attitude. You do this when you're fairly close to the ground. Then, just before you touch your throttle and make a normal, full-stall, three-point landing. Of course, some students have trouble at first in recognizing their rate of descent in relation to their landing spot. For instance, assuming that we're spaced out just about the right distance as we begin this approach, let's stop for a moment and look at our intended landing spot and the field from this abeam position. Imagine that this pad is your landing field. If it looked like this to you, you'd know you're pretty well spaced on it for the amount of altitude you have. If it looked like this, you'd know you were too close in for your altitude, in fact, almost directly above it. If it appeared flattened out like this, you'd know you were too far away for the amount of altitude you have. But bear in mind that it's always the angle at which your line of vision meets the ground that tells you how you're spaced. It's the way the landing field and the ground look to you, and not the relationship of your wingtip to the landing spot. If you use your wingtip for a reference, it'll fool you with every change in the attitude of your plane. So watch the landing spot and the ground and forget about your wing. Now, assuming that this is about right for the abeam position, if the field and landing spot looked like this, you'd know you were too close in. If they looked like this, you'd know you were too far out. So here we're spaced just about right. Now, as we begin our descent, watch the landing spot. Don't let the field flatten out too much or move over under you.
ourselves well spaced on the downwind leg and gauge our rate of turn and rate of descent so the field's apparent flatness is pretty much the same all the way down, our approach should be a good one. And slight adjustments in throttle and attitude on the way down should make it possible for us to hit our intended landing spot without any trouble. You see, the 180-degree power approach is very important. You'll use it for all your landings at the base field, and you'll use it almost exclusively in practically all types of service aircraft, because the power approach gives you positive control over your rate of descent and makes it possible for you to select in advance the exact spot where you intend to land. And incidentally, one mistake that's caused a number of boys to spin in. You're coming down in a power letdown, but you don't think you're descending steeply enough, so you take power all the way or most of the way off. And you don't make enough of a change in your attitude, which leaves you in a nose-high attitude without enough power, and you begin to mush badly. In a matter of seconds, they meet, and you stall. At low altitudes, there usually isn't time to recover before you hit the ground. The only way to be safe in slow flight in the power letdown is to know the sight, sound, and feel of the plane at various airspeeds and various attitudes. Don't depend on your instruments. Unless you're thoroughly familiar with the feel of the airplane in slow flight, you're sure to have trouble with speed control. That's one of the most common mistakes that students make in power approaches. For instance, lots of times they don't slow the plane up enough on the downwind leg. It takes time for a plane to lose speed. You can't get the kind of controlled descent you want until your speed is well down. So if your speed is too fast at the abeam point, you spend a good part of your turn losing the excess speed. And it's only after you've used up quite a lot of your turn that you begin to lose altitude. So you either overshoot your landing spot altogether, or you have to descend too sharply once you do get started. In any case, it's not a good approach. Another mistake in speed control is letting the plane get too fast, especially during the latter part of the approach. Remember, when you pick up extra speed, you somehow have to get rid of it. Usually, you do this by floating. Instead of hitting your landing spot, you float right over it and land somewhere beyond, making this anything but a precision maneuver. On the other hand, if you let your plane get too slow during your approach, you're running the risk of spinning in. And in any case, if you're too slow at the end of your approach, when you cut your throttle, you won't have any reserve buoyancy. So the plane will probably drop short of your landing spot and bounce hard. Another common mistake is to allow the plane to get too far downwind, so it has to be dragged in on the throttle. If you find yourself too low toward the end of your approach, there's something wrong with your pattern, or else your rate of descent was too fast earlier in the approach. So far, we've made all our takeoffs and landings directly into the wind, but you won't always be able to do that. Suppose you wanted to land along a line like this, with the wind coming from out in this direction. You head directly along your landing path. But soon the wind is drifting you off to the left. So your nose is pointed this way, and your wheels want to roll this way. But you're moving over the ground in this direction. Here's what happens when you try to land that way. You already know how to correct for drift. If, when you point your nose along your intended landing line, you see that you're drifting, make a turn so that you're headed somewhat more into the wind. You crab. That is, you use the drift angle method of correction. So your path over the ground corresponds to your intended landing line. But you can't land like this. You'd ground loop just as you did before. So, just an instant before you stall the plane and land it, you bring the nose around so it is pointed in the direction of travel. So you land with the wheels rolling straight along the direction of travel. But how do you know when you're drifting and how much? Well, the wind tee or sock will usually tip you off when to watch for drift, but don't depend on them. As soon as you've turned onto your straightaway, get your wings level, look well ahead, and watch the way the scenery looks in relation to your nose. If you seem to be sliding sideways across the scenery, then you're drifting. Make a small turn into the wind and level your wings again. If, with your wings leveled, you seem to be sliding straight along your landing line, then your path over the ground coincides with your landing line. just before the plane is ready to land, you skid it around with your rudder so that when it touches, the wheels are rolling in the direction of travel. Your biggest problem will be to know just when to bring the nose around. Here's what happens when you bring it around too soon. Even though you've been making a straight path over the ground, bringing the nose around too soon gives the plane time to start drifting before you land. Consequently, you land while drifting, so you might as well not have bothered to correct for drift in the first place. The other extreme to bringing the nose around too early is bringing it around too late, so you land while still partially in a crab. And as for knowing just when to bring the nose around, there's only one way you can do that. You've got to be able to feel when the plane is ready to land. But there's another method of correcting for drift on landing. You get your nose pointed straight down your intended landing line, with your wings level, and you look for drift. If you're getting any, ease the windward wing down slightly by applying aileron. Naturally, this will tend to make the plane turn to the windward, but don't let it. Keep the nose straight by applying opposite rudder. If you get the wing down just the right amount, the drift will stop. As you descend, you'll probably find that the amount of drift varies, so you'll have to vary your correction accordingly. Then, as you break your glide, at the same time, smoothly level your wings, being careful to keep the plane straight. The wing should be completely level at the instant you reach the three-point attitude and are ready to land. When you use the wing down method of drift correction, you're traveling through the air in this direction. And in a no-wind condition, you would make a path over the ground like this. But while you're traveling through the air in this direction, the entire body of air is moving, drifting you in this direction. So, by using just the right amount of drift correction, you can make a path over the ground to coincide with your landing path and with the direction your nose is pointed. The natural tendency once you're on the ground in a crosswind landing is to relax a little. You've got it down safely, you think. Before you can think again, you ground loop. Let's go back and analyze that ground loop. You correct for drift and make a good landing. But even though you're on the ground, the wind is still trying to lift your windward wing. Also, anytime the plane is on the ground, it wants to turn into the wind like a weather vane. If you let the plane get away from you for even a second, the ground loop starts. The plane wheels around toward the direction the wind is coming from. The force of the turn tends to throw the outside wing down even further. The momentum of the turn becomes so great, the plane doesn't turn into the wind and stop. It keeps going on around. You end up by dragging a wingtip or smashing an aileron, or you may even go over on your back. Handling the plane after it hits the ground, that's the real test of a good crosswind landing. Because no matter how experienced you are, you'll occasionally misjudge your drift. And there'll be times when air currents close to the ground will reverse your drift at the last instant. So you land in a drift in spite of your corrections. But if you handle the plane properly, there's very little reason to ground loop. In a crosswind takeoff, the same procedure applies. The wind will try to lift your windward wing. The plane will want to turn into the wind. You hold the plane straight with rudder and keep the wings level with your ailerons. But there's another problem you'll encounter in a crosswind takeoff. Watch how this plane skips sideways during its takeoff run. The wind is literally blowing it across the runway. Now, watch this takeoff. Notice that the plane assumes a tail high or nose low takeoff attitude. This holds the wheels firmly on the ground, giving them enough friction to prevent skipping. Then, when the plane has plenty of speed, the pilot eases the nose up and flies the plane off. In other words, when you assume your takeoff attitude, instead of bringing the nose down to about here, bring it down even further, say to about here, and hold that attitude until you have plenty of speed. Then, when the plane is ready to fly, ease the nose up and fly it off. But, of course, you'll start to drift immediately you're off the ground. To prevent this, turn slightly into the wind as you climb, so you make a straight path over the ground. In other words, use the crab or drift angle method of correction. But don't think that I'm trying to give you any hard and fast rules for drift correction or power approaches or anything else, because there aren't any. If you fly for the rest of your life, you'll probably never encounter the same air conditions twice. The density of the air varies, the wind varies. And there are up and down winds as well as winds across the ground. Convection currents, we call them. Sometimes these make you stay up when you should be coming down, or they bring you down when you should stay up. No, if there were any rules in flying, you could boil them down to this. Learn to recognize what's happening to the plane, and then make whatever corrections are necessary to cause the plane to do what you want it to do.